My name is Eric Stokin. I'm the director of the Center for Social Science Scholarship. In this capacity, I have the distinct pleasure of coordinating lecture series and workshops, such as this one, focused on demonstrating your impact beyond academia. This series invites experts from government, media, community organizations, and academia to discuss how to translate their scholarship to non-academic audiences effectively. To this end, we are incredibly fortunate to have Eric Luedtke join us today. Before I introduce Eric, I would like to note that the next lecture in this series will feature UMBC's own Dr. Ariel Cooperberg, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Public Health, who will deliver a talk titled Translating Research for a Public Audience, Writing for the Public and Talking to the Press. At the Center for Social Science Scholarship, our goal is to help amplify your work and connect it with audiences beyond academia. We've developed a simple way to help you share your professional accomplishments with a broader public. Whether your achievements include traditional academic outputs like journal articles or book publications, or more public-facing contributions such as delivering legislative testimony, writing an op-ed, or responding to a federal regulation, we want to help spotlight that impact. To make this process easier, we've created a short form where you can let us know how you'd like your work to be shared. You can learn more about this and these series by visiting us at socialscience@umbc.edu. I also invite you to engage with the Center for Social Science Scholarship on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram at UMBC SOC SCI. I think now more than ever, as public opinion towards higher education becomes increasingly skeptical, it's essential that we in academia learn how to more effectively articulate the real world impact of our scholarly work. One especially important arena for this is government, where research has the potential to shape policy and improve people's lives, but only if we communicate it clearly and connect it to the needs of decision makers. Given his experience bridging these worlds, Eric Luedtke is the perfect person to help us think through these challenges. Eric Luedtke is the Director of Capital Projects in the Office of the Secretary for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. Eric's career has bridged the worlds of government theory and practice. A popular former clinical professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, Eric helped train and equip students to serve in a range of roles for state and local government and the nonprofit sector. He has also worked in a number of prominent positions in state government, from elected office in the Maryland House of Delegates, where he rose through the ranks to serve as majority leader, to the executive branch, where he was one of Governor Wes Moore's day one hires. His unique perspective is shaped by being an insider in both the world of state government and the world of academia. Navigating these two worlds is certainly an impressive feat. Thank you for joining us today, Eric. I will now turn it over to you for your remarks.
Well, and thank you, Eric, as well. And thank you all for joining us today. I did prepare some remarks and a brief slideshow, hopefully brief, if I don't go on too long, and then really wanted to leave a lot of time for conversation back and forth. And let's dive in. The question I really want to tackle today is like, how can we build better connections between state level policymakers and social scientists? And I'm focused in particular on state level policymakers, A, because that's where my experience is, and B, because I think right now, given everything that's going on in Washington, the states, not just Maryland, but other states, are kind of where a lot of the action's happening in policy innovation. So they're an ideal place for academia and social scientists to kind of engage in conversations about solving the big problems that government is trying to solve. But I'll start briefly just by adding to the introduction. Like any former politician, I'm happy to spend time talking about myself. The introduction went through kind of my more recent experience, but my career actually started as an educator. I was a middle school teacher for more than a decade. And so a lot of my engagement with public policy early on was about education policy. Um, and when I got elected to the legislature, that was kind of my specialty when I started. Legislators in all states, but in Maryland in particular, because the way our committee structure works, legislators tend to really specialize. They find a niche of policy that they work on, and that niche for me was education policy. I was part of the development of the blueprint for Maryland's future. I did a tremendous amount of work on special ed issues, but bridged out from there over time. Like anyone's career, my career altered its trajectory over time. And by the end of my service in the legislature, I was really heavily focused on revenue and the state budget. And then when I went into the governor's office, my role was chief legislative officer. So my primary job was managing the governor's relationships with the legislature, but every governor's office is structured differently, and in some ways it's dependent on how the individual personalities within the governor's office interact. So I was not just his lobbyist; I was also a major policy advisor and helped to run his executive order development and legislative development. The other thing I'll mention is, I've worked in academia, but I'm not an academic. I don't have a PhD. I've never been published. So, my while I've got experience in both worlds, my deeper experience is really in the policymaking side of things. And one of the questions that I kind of wrestled with both when I was a legislator and at the University of Maryland, College Park, when I was in the School of Public Policy there, is why there's this gap between research and policymakers. And I'm using the term policymakers here broadly. I don't just mean elected officials and high-level appointed officials. I also mean the bureaucrats within agencies like I am now, who are doing the day-to-day work of government. Why is it that we don't talk very often? Why is it that decisions in government often get made without the input of social scientists? Why is it that social scientists aren't always proactive about engaging in the day-to-day work of government? And I think there's a lot of ways to approach that question. As I was sort of putting down notes for the conversation today, I was thinking about it in terms of these three sub-questions I have here. First of all, what are the ways that we see research influencing policymaking right now? What are some potential causes of disconnects between academia and policymakers, and how can we strengthen that connection? So that's kind of how I'm going to work through the conversation and my thoughts. The truth is that right now, most of the time, the way that research ends up influencing policymaking is very indirect. In my experience in the legislature, I was there 12 years. I can count on one hand the number of times I had direct conversations with social science researchers on topics I was legislating on. Almost all of those were contacts that I initiated myself. So, for example, I did some work. The committee I was on did a lot of work on casino and horse racing policy. And so I reached out to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, which has a center on gambling policy, in particular, to better understand some of the social science research about gambling addiction. Another example, I did some work reforming the education program in our juvenile services facilities. And as I was starting to engage in that topic, I kind of looked around for a researcher who worked in that area and ended up working very closely with a guy, now retired professor at College Park named Peter Leone, who was an expert on education in carceral settings. But for most legislators, those conversations aren't necessarily happening. And even for me, they happened relatively rarely. Much of the research that ends up filtering through to policymakers is filtered through intermediaries, right? These entities that take information from the work that you all do in academia, translate it for a general public, and then pass it on to policymakers. I think there's a little more of direct conversation when it comes to bureaucracies and agencies. That's because you have a similar level of specialization in bureaucracies and agencies as you do in academia. and you have a fair amount of people in agencies who come out of academia or who have at least some academic training. But certainly for elected officials, I mean, when I got elected to the legislature and I got appointed to the Ways and Means Committee, I was a middle school teacher. The guy sitting to the left of me in committee ran a jewelry store, and the guy on my right was a truck driver. We're not necessarily trained in social science. We're not necessarily trained to understand the research that's being done. So, like everyone else, we get a lot of our information from these intermediary sources, and that includes the news media, includes advocacy groups, it includes popular writers. There are those rare unicorns in government who are academics or at some point have academic training, and they often serve as sort of gap bridgers, if I can make up a term. I'll give you an example from Maryland. There's a legislator named Laura Charkoudian who has a PhD in economics, and she serves on the Economic Matters Committee in the House of Delegates and does a lot of work in particular on energy policy. So she's got the training to really understand in depth the research that's happening around energy policy, but most people don't. And that creates some problems because, as you all know, there are problems with those entities, those intermediaries that are filtering research information. Media, of course, there's been a ton of research by social scientists on sort of how information flows through the news media to the public, particularly about research. And, as you all know, the media has a different goal than researchers. Their job is to get viewers or to sell newspapers. In order to do that, they often sensationalize or oversimplify things. Reporters often don't have any type of social science training, so they may have trouble understanding the information themselves, and then they're responsible for translating it to the general public. And of course, there are media sources increasingly now that start with inherent biases and look for research that reinforces those biases in their reporting. Advocacy groups, similarly, they have a different set of motivations than researchers. They generally start from a place of wanting to advocate for specific policies, and then they often will cherry pick research that supports the position that they have. One of the great phenomenons of legislating in Annapolis is that the legislators work in a set of office buildings across College Avenue from State Circle, where the State House is. And every day they walk over to the State House in order to go to the floor and talk about bills and vote. And in between is an area called Lawyers Mall. And it is a daily occurrence that there are either protesters or advocacy groups on Lawyers Mall handing out fact sheets. And those fact sheets often cite research, but it's not an unbiased set of research that's being presented to you. It's research that supports the point of view of the advocacy group. Increasingly, you've seen this rise of popular writers writing nonfiction books about public policy topics in ways that have kind of broken through into popular discussions. Abundance is a good example of one of these. I will tell you that in the progressive policymaking circles I travel in, everyone's read Abundance. Everyone's talking about it. And it is definitely influencing how people are looking at housing policy in particular, but other types of policy as well. But even though I think a lot of these nonfiction writers, like I think Abundance is a great book. I think the writers did a good job. It's got its flaws. Even though they go in much more depth than your average newspaper reporter or TV reporter, they still tend to oversimplify things. They're writing for an audience. They want to sell books, right? And so it's not always driven by what drives a social scientist in terms of trying to find the truth, find out the actual cause of policy problems. Sometimes it's driven by what sells books, what's interesting, stories that readers will find fascinating. And so you've got these intermediaries, these mediating entities. They're delivering research to policymakers. That presentation of research is often deeply flawed. It's often oversimplified. It's often not comprehensive. And that leads to bad policymaking. So the question is, what's causing this gap? Like, why is it that social scientists and policymakers aren't talking to each other directly more often? And I think there's a set of core questions that need to be answered in the affirmative by both sides before those conversations can even happen. There are some policymakers who aren't necessarily interested in having a conversation with social scientists because they they don't answer these questions affirmatively, right? You need to agree, first of all, that something that's happening is a problem that needs to be solved. You need to agree that it can be solved. You need to agree that it should be solved. And then you need to agree that both government and social science should have some role in solving it. And here you run into the issue of the basic ideological perspectives of legislators, right? Um, you know, elected officials in particular get elected, high level appointees like secretaries get appointed often because they agree with a certain ideology. So if social science, for example, if a social scientist would argue that government is not the best entity to solve a problem, but the policymaker really believes that government should solve it, there's a disconnect and they're not going to be able to even have a conversation. Likewise, if you have an elected official who doesn't believe that government can solve problems and a social scientist who does, there's a disconnect. Um, so, those are cases where it's really hard to bridge the gap, I think, where you're not really going to be able to get to a point of even having a conversation without some one side or the other kind of rethinking their fundamental perspective. But then even if you get a policymaker and a social scientist who do agree that a phenomenon is a problem, that it can be solved, that it should be solved, that social science has something to say about it and government can play a role in solving it, I think you still have some significant problems that interfere with the relationship. I find that my training as a teacher makes me think a lot about motivation. And when I was a school teacher in middle school, um, motivation, understanding your students' motivation is the key to doing your job well. The good teacher is constantly questioning the motivations of their students. Why is this student motivated to do work or not motivated to do their homework? Why is this student motivated to act out in class? A good teacher identifies those motivations, identifies the antecedents of their behavior, and then addresses those antecedents. I think I often apply a similar frame to understand policymaking. And politicians and bureaucrats and social scientists fundamentally have a different set of motivations. What defines success for each of those roles is fundamentally different. Politicians need votes. They want to get reelected. And so that means, yes, they want to solve problems, but they want to solve problems in ways that are popular. Social science sometimes comes up with answers to public policy problems that are deeply, deeply unpopular. And that makes it hard for politicians to adopt them because it would threaten their career unless you get the rare politician who is willing to take a tough stance on an issue. The bureaucracy, more than anything, is driven by compliance, by the need to comply with an expansive and complex set of statutes and regulations that govern their job. They rise through the bureaucracy by not making mistakes, by not going out of compliance with procurement rules or fiscal rules within a department or laws passed by a legislature that define the scope of their work. And social scientists, for the most part, are driven by, if you want to succeed in social science, you need to publish, right? You want to do new research. You want to do innovative research. You want to come up with new ideas and theoretical frameworks. There is a common factor between these three groups, right? They all want to solve problems and they want to do so successfully. But the way they define success may be very different, right? And that creates, I think, a fundamental disconnect in a lot of situations. As an example, in tax policy, where I've done a lot of work in my career, there's a lot of fascinating research, particularly in the economics literature, about revenue policies and their impacts on the economy and their impacts on society, and how, for example, revenue policies that are done right can help reduce inequality in society. A good example of that is the how we handle tax deductions in this country, right? The tax deduction system, as it's currently established in federal law and then as it translates down into state law, it disproportionately benefits wealthy people, right? If you're making $25,000 a year in the state of Maryland, you're probably not claiming itemized deductions. If you're making 500,000, you are. And the itemization process essentially can help you to pay less, even with a higher tax rate in a progressivized tax system, can help you to pay less than regular working people. So it seems obvious to a social scientist interested in creating a tax system that reduces inequality that you should get rid of itemized deductions. Well, that was actually proposed this past legislative session. It was part of Governor Moore's original budget proposal. His proposal wasn't to eliminate itemized deductions, but it was to cap them. And the net result of his proposal would be to both raise additional revenue for the state in order to pay for public services and to make the tax system arguably more fair. Well, as you would expect, a proposal like that ran into serious political headwinds. And the politicians in the legislature, who were very interested in getting reelected, were hearing a lot from constituencies who were concerned about the proposed changes and deductions. And so a version of that did pass, but it didn't go nearly as far as the governor's proposal originally suggested. So, those conflicting motivations have a big role to play in sort of the disconnect, I think, between academia and politicians in particular. There are a lot of other, I think, potential reasons why these disconnects exist. One of them is really simple. The social scientists and policymakers don't interact that often. There aren't a lot of opportunities for academia to interact with Annapolis politics, or to interact even with people in the agencies in state government. And so, those opportunities need to be created somehow. And more often than not, it's ad hoc, right? There is no systematic way to do it. As a policymaker, I'll tell you the number one way that a new issue or a new potential solution to a policy problem was brought to my attention was somebody reaching out to me, and not through emails or letters or even testimony in committee hearings, but through a request for a direct meeting. The best ideas for new legislation or new policy proposals come about, in my opinion, from face-to-face conversations. So unless an academic was willing to come to me or come to Annapolis and sit down face-to-face and have an in-depth conversation, unless that conversation was happening at a time when I had the time to really sit down and engage in an in-depth conversation, which is not during the 90 days of our legislative session, by the way, because policymakers have no time during that legislative session, then those conversations weren't happening. And, I think part of the solution to that, well, we'll get to solutions in a second, and I'll talk about that a little bit. I think there's also a culture clash and a lack of a common language between social scientists and legislators. And let me talk about what I mean by that. Legislators have a culture. Every legislative body has a different culture. The culture within the state legislature in Maryland is different than the culture within the state legislature in Virginia, which is different from Congress. And I think social scientists understand that because of, that it makes logical sense. And because there's a fair amount of research, particularly in the political science literature, about those cultures. But to understand a specific culture is hard. Because you have to actually engage with the people that are part of that culture. And the Annapolis culture is dominated by people who engage in it full time, by the legislators themselves, by the lobbying corps, by the leaders of major advocacy groups. They are kind of the active participants in it. So in order for an academic who comes from outside of that and can't spend 90 days full time in Annapolis engaged in those conversations to understand the culture, they have to kind of enter that space open to new experiences and open to understanding that there's a different set of norms for behavior in Annapolis than there is on campus. And to get a little more specific, what I mean by that is, going back to that motivation question, within academia, there's a motivation to be specific and precise in the language that you use. The terms that you use in political science or other areas of social science are often clearly and deeply defined and may have a completely different meaning than they do to the average layman and than they do to the average policymaker, who is themselves often originally a layman. So in order to even speak to each other and have those conversations be productive, I think it requires some thought about how you're talking, what you're saying, the language that you're using, and how you're approaching the conversation with legislators or with other policymakers. So how do you fix that? How do you approach policymakers in ways that will make it more likely for the research that you're doing to play into those decisions that policymakers are making on a daily basis? One, I think as social scientists are making the case around their policies, they need to understand that the motivation of policymakers is not just about the policy, it's also about the politics. So as you are developing your research and thinking about how to translate that into the policy world, I think it's worth taking the time to think through what is motivating the policymaker you're speaking to. And I mean the individual policymaker you're speaking to, right? The political dynamics for me when I was in the legislature were different than the political dynamics for a Republican legislator from a rural part of the state. So making the research, sort of defining and describing the research in a way that speaks to the unique needs of the policymaker you're speaking to will make it more likely that they will listen. The other thing that I think is important for social scientists to understand is that policymakers are more likely to listen to arguments from people with whom they have a pre-existing relationship. And what that means is that I'm more likely to pay attention to what you're saying to me and to the research that you're talking about to me if I know you, if you've got my phone number, if we've sat down in the 9 months of the interim from the legislative session and had conversations, then if you happen to show up for a 15-minute meeting in my office during the legislative session or show up to offer 2 minutes of testimony on a bill that's come before me in the 5th hour of my bill hearing, taking the time to actually develop those relationships ahead of time will make it much more likely that your research will translate. And that applies too to bureaucrats, because similar to legislators or other elected officials, the bureaucrats within agencies have very stressful jobs that take up a lot of time, particularly in this era, this never-ending era of budget cuts and inadequate staffing. Their schedules are often full, and so what breaks through in terms of what type of research they're paying attention to is, it's more likely to be research that comes from someone they know. Case in point, I've got 7 other meetings during my day today in Howard County and Baltimore City online. I took time to do this presentation today because Malia Cromer, who I've known for many years, reached out and asked me to participate in it, right? So developing that relationship is important. That immediately begs the question of, you all have limited time too. Social scientists have limited time also. So how do you know who to reach out to? And that's a question that I think often stands in the way of developing those relationships. The truth is, though, that whatever research you're doing, there are a limited set of people in state government who care about that research, right? If you're doing research, for example, as Peter Leone was, on education in carceral settings, and in particular in juvenile services settings, there are only a handful of legislators that actively work on legislation on that topic. There are only a handful of people within the State Department of Juvenile Services who work on that topic. For him, taking the time to develop relationships with those people, that small set of people, was worth it in the long run, because he was able then to translate his research into the decisions being made by policymakers. I think another way to bridge the gap is through creating a lot of opportunities for interaction. A lot of the universities, they host events in Annapolis during the legislative session, and you'll see students and sometimes professors go down to Annapolis and have conversations with legislators. Those are worth participating in, but also it's very worth inviting policymakers to come to campus, right? To speak to your classes, to participate in conversations on campus. Those interactions are often framed around the budget, right? Like, why is it that UMBC or College Park or Morgan State or UMES hosts events in Annapolis during sessions? Because they have a budget ask, and in particular, they want to ask legislators to fund their budget. But those can also be venues for translating research into actual policy. And I'll tell you, as a legislator, my district, the district I represented, is in northern Montgomery County. There is no university campus in my district. And the types of invitations that legislators often get to campuses are driven often by who represents the area around the campus. Well, that's not the majority of legislators. It's definitely not the majority of policymakers. So those opportunities to visit and to hear about research are too far and in between. And then, in terms of the culture clash issue and language, I was very careful not to say that social scientists should kind of dumb down their research when they're talking to policymakers, because that's not what it is. It's a question of finding ways to use non-technical language to explain technical concepts in your research. And that doesn't come naturally, I think, to a lot of social scientists, because the incentive within the profession is not to do that, right? When you're doing a presentation at a conference, when you're writing for a journal, you're intentionally not doing that because you need to speak the common language of academia. But that common language of academia is not the language of policymakers. So you need to find ways to reach policymakers where they're at, and help them to understand things. And sometimes that can include explaining concepts that are kind of fairly basic to you. But again, remember, most legislators, most policymakers, they don't have training in economics. They don't have training in statistics. They don't understand how research is conducted and how the scientific process develops statements about the best solutions to problems. So I know that was quick. I promised the organizers to spend no more than half an hour talking to you. And I want to turn now to a discussion or a conversation, and see what questions you have or what thoughts you have about from your perspective as well. So, Eric.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Eric. And it's very clear to me that you're an educator. You've really laid this out in a very comprehensive and thoughtful way. So I appreciate you doing that. I'll sort of kick it off with a question, and then please feel free to raise your hand or whatnot, and we'll call on you. So you, I think, do a great job of unpacking where the disconnect comes from. And I want to ask a question about the motivations in particular. So when I think about it, of course, we have the kind of incentive structures and the costs and the benefits to this kind of engagement, right? And the cost on the academic side, of course, is spending additional time outside of research to communicate with policymakers or bureaucrats, maybe translating some of it into thinking about what the political implications are. And I did want to acknowledge that there are other entities that can help sort of minimize some of these costs. Like we just had the Scholar Strategy Network as the sort of lead off in this series. They can help with that process. But I'd actually like to ask you a question about the benefits, right? So I think institutionally, as an institution, UMBC may be very clear on like what some of the benefits are to this kind of engagement. But could you speak at all to the benefits to individual faculty members or researchers in engaging with legislators or engaging with bureaucrats, either in sort of the short term or long term?
Yeah, and I think most of the researchers I've worked with over my time, they're doing the research they want to do because they want to help fix something. Something's broken, they want to help fix it. Fundamentally, that's what policymakers do too. I think, there's value in that. Just, that's part of the reason you're doing the work you're doing. But also, policymaking presents a lot of opportunities for experimentation, right? For trying to see if the research you're developing is accurate, if there are real world applications to it. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for researchers to bring an idea to policymakers, for policymakers to implement a version of it, to try it out and bring it back to the researchers in kind of an iterative process. So I think it can actually help improve research to have the ability to actually implement it. The challenge is, that real world implementation of experiments is tough in social science generally, and it's tough in particular because there are so many constraints in government about trying new programs. But you've seen within policymaking a little bit of a shift towards a more scientific perspective on policymaking. I think you're seeing more willingness by policymakers to try out new ideas, to try to apply research. You see this in a lot of states where they've created, and we have one now, offices of innovation that are really trying to find ways to use applied research to innovate what government does. So I think it circles back to help researchers sort of improve their research over time. Also, frankly, to be very blunt, funding too, right? These same policymakers who are helping to implement policies also control the state budget. And you see in places where a particular researcher has done a good job developing a relationship with policymakers, you'll often see opportunities for increased funding for the work that you're doing on campus.
Great.
Unless you're producing poll numbers that the politician doesn't like, Malia Cromer.
Don't do that, Malia. Don't do that. All right, great. Well, let's open it up. I mean, I see a number of colleagues here who I know have actually bridged this disconnect quite well. Anyone have questions? Yeah, Malia.
Oh, I have a question. So listen, you talked about both the direct and indirect ways in which social scientists can influence or get in front of you. I think I'm just curious to hear your perspective on things like op-ed writing. I'm just speaking mostly in the indirect way. I mean, when somebody, a social scientist takes their research, boils it down, gets to the jargon out of it, and then writes something for Maryland Matters or for the Sun or the Post. I mean, how impactful are that sort of activity on just getting your ideas to the legislative body and other policymakers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on the quality of the op-ed.
Okay.
Op-eds have, I think one of the biggest strengths of op-eds is they can serve an agenda setting role, right? The legislators and policymakers generally are very driven by news coverage. So, an issue that's not on the policy agenda can get on the policy agenda just by dint of a really strong op-ed. I think, though, a lot of times what can happen is that a researcher is writing an op-ed focused on their research, and they're not necessarily focused on the audience they're writing for, right? if I want policymakers to pay attention to this, I need to frame it in a way that it seems applicable and understandable to them, as addressing a problem that they're concerned about. And I think in that respect, it behooves researchers to pay attention to what's being covered in terms of major policy issues, right? What are the policy issues that are already on the agenda? Is there a way that your research can speak to solving that particular problem? I think the other challenge, frankly, is that anyone can write an op-ed. And so I think you have academics writing op-eds that are grounded in research, but we live in an area of information overload. I think a lot of policymakers, they might read an op-ed, but a lot of times they'll dismiss op-eds generally as, just more noise. And so they might not pay as much attention to it, which is why I think developing those direct relationships is really important, right? I care a lot more about an op-ed written by a researcher who I know than I do about an op-ed by a researcher I've never heard of. That's more likely to kind of break through.
And just as a follow-up, what do you think permeates more when you see an op-ed written by somebody or somebody quoted as an expert on an issue in somebody else in a newspaper or something like that? I'm just curious.
I mean, me personally, I tend to pay more attention than op-eds because I like long form. I have a lot of respect for the press, so I don't mean this to be like a really negative criticism, but like they get things wrong a lot and they misquote people a lot and take things out of context. And so I'm a lot more likely to pay attention personally to research that's described in an op-ed because it's written by the researcher themselves. And so I know it's really coming across the way that they mean, than I am to sort of pay attention to a random quote buried halfway down an article. Here's a good example of it. Here's the other thing about op-eds and news generally. What gets the attention of policymakers most is when that op-ed or the news is critical of work they're doing, right? That breaks through pretty quickly. So there was an article that came out earlier this week talking about living shorelines, which is something my department does. It's an environmental remediation method where instead of lining the bay with walls of riprap beds, we actually build marshes and more natural settings for the bay to kind of interact with land. It's good for the bay, and we pay people to do it. We put state money into paying to do it. And some of those projects are in places, where, the public has access, and some of them aren't, because frankly, it helps the bay if that rich guy who's got waterfront property has a shoreline that's not eroding and dumping more sediment into the bay, and isn't using methods that direct more erosion onto his poor neighbor's property. But the article that came out this week was framed as living shorelines are for rich people. And it only had one perspective. Now that article very much, it got read by my secretary, got read by all the leadership in the department. We paid attention to it. Mostly what we did was gripe about how we thought it was a terrible article and it didn't include the whole perspective. But that's the challenge with the news media, right? Like it's not always the best way to get information across. And what that article did, it quoted one researcher on one side of the issue and didn't talk to any of the researchers who have shown repeatedly that living shorelines are a better way to line the bay. So.
Great, thank you. I see Laura's hand. And then Roy.
Hi, thanks for joining us today. I'm Lauriette Kobiak. I'm a professor in the political science department, director of our Sondheim Public Affairs Scholars Program, and also a long time ago alumna of the University of Maryland School of Public Policy.
Hey, go Terps.
Yeah.
The Retrievers are fine too, guys.
Okay, good. Just wanted to ask you for some more specifics on your sense of what lawmakers' research needs are. You talked generically about the interest in research that involves experiments with real-world implementation of innovative designs and programs. But are there any specific policy or program areas that strike you as being an area that's a real vacuum for research, where policymakers are particularly curious about what kinds of strategies work well and what strategies aren't working well, and where they might learn from academics?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question to answer because, I mean, first of all, the policies that policymakers are most interested in are driven, as you would expect, by where the public is focused, right? Um, so, I think there's a lot of opportunity for these types of conversations on those big ticket things, but they change relatively quickly. I mean, there's some standard issues that always pop up. Crime policy is a great example, right? How to reduce crime. But there's others, like housing was not an issue that we talked about a few years ago. And now it's, probably at the top of the Annapolis political agenda. I think that question it's less about the topic than it is about the person. I think you'll find that there, as you would expect, there's some policymakers that care more about what research says than others, and finding those people is important. And so on crime policy, for example, the chair of both the House and Senate committees that deal with crime policy are really interested in talking to academics and hearing about research. But you don't necessarily experience that with some other issue areas and the legislators that do the primary work in those issue areas. I don't know if that helps. That's also a general response to a question that was asking for more specifics. So
That's okay. I get it.
yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. Turn to Roy.
So Eric, thanks for the talk. It was really great. I do miss having you in the legislature, but I'm glad you're in DNR because DNR can use you, especially after that bill that you passed a couple of years ago.
Yeah, yeah. That's the part I didn't tell the rest of you. Roy's referring. The last big bill I passed in the legislature was the Great Maryland Outdoors Act, which was supposed to reform the Park Service, and it was the largest investment in the parks in the state's history. So I'm in the unique position now of implementing a bill that I passed as a legislator and realizing all of the mistakes I made in writing that bill.
It was a pretty good bill. So I actually have a suggestion. I want to see what you think about it. You mentioned how legislators are so busy during the 90 days. I have a number of students that do former students that do fiscal notes, and a number of students also in DBM. And similarly, they're incredibly busy during budget seasons and the legislative session. But they can do more research when you're away or when the legislators are out of Annapolis.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one thing that the state legislature could do more of is commission more studies. For example, there's a regular requirement to look at some of the tax credits, like the One Maryland tax credit and so on. And those tend to be pretty well done and rely upon good research by tax economists. On the other hand, during session, as you know, and I had the personal experience on the state services, the sales services tax. It's not easy really to get anything across in a hearing when there hasn't been an extensive research project beforehand.
Right.
And that's a big problem with the blueprint. The blueprint was pretty well designed. At least I think it drew heavily on social science research on the spending side. But, the legislature avoided the funding issue, and it's been patching it year after year after year.
Right.
The last time there was a state study of the state's revenue structure, in my memory, a comprehensive one, was in 1990, 1991, the Lino study. And I think the state would be better off if the legislature would say, okay, let's look at our overall revenue structure instead of doing it piecemeal or having the governor put together a proposal each year.
Yeah.
So what do you think about this option of, I'm flipping it a bit, saying it's not just the social scientists' responsibility to talk to the legislature appropriately, which I think you're absolutely right on, but that the state periodically has to ask for more from the experts in the state and outside of the state.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. I think that's completely accurate. I think there's a number of things that make that difficult. One is I would recommend nobody ever use the word report in Annapolis because there are too many of them, right? The
Yeah.
state over time has mandated literally thousands of annual reports, most of which never get read by anyone and just get buried in the DLS library. So I think what you're talking about is more along the lines of a major study on a significant policy issue,
Right.
right? And yes, I think those tend to produce some of the best policy outcomes. The blueprint's a good example of that, right? There was a firm hired by DLS who did a tremendous amount of work consolidating research on education policy that was then considered by the members of the commission that developed the blueprint bill. Nothing similar happened over the last few years with revenues, in part because it's politically touchy and it's a timing issue, right? You don't want a tax conversation in an election year for a variety of reasons. So, and you know, when a when a decision is being made or has to be made because the budget's not in good shape, doesn't always line up well with the timelines needed to do the kind of research or provide the kind of research that went into the blueprint. So that's not to say it can't be done, but on your first premise that the state government needs to do a better job reaching out to researchers, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think there are some legislators that are willing to do it. The question is how to institutionalize it, right?
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
I did see
I
the
have
oh, go ahead, Malia.
I have one more. I'm sorry. I'm
No,
obviously very
that's good.
interested in this topic. So one of the things that I was strongly considering doing with the Institute of Politics is creating a small sort of student-driven sort of research arm that if somebody from DNR came to us and was interested in sort of public opinion towards X, Y, and Z issue,
Right.
do you and obviously we'd offer that service quote unquote for free. Obviously you are using state funds to to pay for the work that we're doing. How do you think that works? Like that kind of relationship works? Like, years ago I did a survey, and I was at a private college then, so it didn't
Mhm.
really make a difference,
Right.
about parks, and we won this a park or the parks awards you guys give out for that. But when it's a state university to state agency, what does that look like if we would do sort of like free work for you as sort of a student, but as like student learning? I'm curious if anything comes to mind, like a procurement issue or something on your
No,
end that comes to
there's no
mind.
procurement issue. So College Park School of Public Policy does something like that in their grad
Okay.
program. They a few years ago added a capstone project at
Hmm.
the end of the program. And so a group of students will essentially do like an academic research project around a pertinent policy issue that some
Hmm.
agency or state government or some legislators focused on. And I actually worked with a couple of those groups on both sides of the equation, right? I worked with a couple of them when I was a professor, and I worked with a couple of them as a legislator. I think the biggest challenge is that the student projects in that, like, they're time limited, right? You
Yeah.
you you need a grade at some point. And so as the policymaker, often like the research will come back and you're looking at it and saying, well, I have more questions, and now where do I go with those questions, right? um, but there's no procurement issue with it whatsoever unless the state is actively paying for it, in
Hmm.
which case you got to find a workaround. And a lot of agencies do have workarounds. There are, procurement law is complex, as I'm learning in this new job. And so there's ways to get that kind of work done. And I'm thinking, for example, like DNR, we have a procurement exception for something called conservation service agreements. And we can use those for quasi academic work around things like historic rehabilitation and historical interpretation on our properties. So we have, we don't tend, to my knowledge, we don't have. Oh, we do have one, but it's Washington College has a grant from us through a conservation service agreement to do reforestation and meadow planting in a number of our Eastern Shore parks, and then they're going to study over time the impacts of that in the local ecosystems, right? So that didn't require a traditional procurement. That was just essentially a memorandum of agreement between us and the university. And a lot of agencies have versions of that, but it's not like standardized. So if you wanted them to pay you, you'd have to pay attention to procurement law. If you don't, no, you just need to get somebody to agree that they're interested.
Oh, thank you.
I did see in the comment a comment about the academic echo chamber versus being normal. I'll just say I hear that comment. I'll say I don't see it as being normal, right? Like the way academics talk is normal in academia, and the way policymakers talk is normal in policymaking. I just look at it as a way to bridge that gap, right? And I do think most policymakers, they tend to get information in a way similar to the general public. So, I think that's probably what you mean by being normal. But yeah, it's just a question of, different codes of speech.
Right. Well, we probably have time for one more question if anyone has. Otherwise, I'm happy to offer one. I mean, so you've just highlighted at least a couple sets of relationships that seem to work well with like the School of Public Policy and what that engagement looks like. Are there others that you would say are sort of a model that you've seen, whether it's Annapolis or in other states, where they really do a good job in connecting scholars and researchers to governmental officials, whether it's elected or bureaucrats, that would serve as kind of a model for what that partnership looks like?
Yeah, first of all, I'll just say I think UMBC does it better than most campuses. That's been my experience, at least. Like one of my complaints when I was at College Park is that there's a tremendous amount of research being done on campus, and it didn't always translate well to Annapolis, even though it was the state's flagship university, right? I think they're working on that, but part of that is, I think, my sense is that you've had a lot of researchers over the years at UMBC who've really taken the time to build those relationships I was talking about earlier. I think, a couple thoughts here. One, take advantage of the people that cross the boundaries between those worlds, right? Like John Willis is a great example. Like he was a professor, is a professor, does a lot of work with the universities, also has deep experience in government. Like they can be Sherpas, like they can help you bridge those gaps. Two, I think like what Malia was talking about, like these systematic programs where you can create opportunities for students or researchers to work directly with legislators helps. I think what Roy was mentioning earlier about having people who leave your classrooms and end up in state government, I think those are really important bridges too. So DLS a few years ago created what's called their Legislative Fellows program, and that is a great kind of pathway for students who are getting high quality social science instruction to then carry that forward. But also those students then have a pre-existing relationship with you as a researcher. So the more opportunities you have to get students of yours into places within public agencies and within the legislature, I think the better things will be. The schools, I have less direct experience out of state, but I've heard anecdotally from former legislative colleagues in other parts of the country that there's some schools that really do a good job. University of Michigan, for example, I think has some really strong relationships. UT Austin, I think, has some fairly strong relationships. But it depends. I'm going back to that culture conversation. It depends to some extent on the culture of the individual institution and how much they emphasize with their researchers that they should be doing this applied work, right?
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. And thank you so much for joining us today. This has really been wonderful. Very appreciative. And I think you've given us a lot to think about and a lot to work with. So Appreciate you taking the time, and thanks to Malia for also shifting that motivation mechanism for you to join us. So
She told me I get to pick a poll question on our next poll. So.
Oh, wow. All right. So that's how this really works. Okay, now I get it. I get it. So great. Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time today. Really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you very much.